Hello and welcome to really the final lecture, unless this is a class where I'm doing societal effects of video games next. But this is sort of the final lecture on just how to actually create a game, how to make a game design document, what you have to think through when you're creating a video game. By the way, it's worth saying this is a computer science class, and everything we've talked about here is also everything you need to do when you're building software, making a software of anything, whether it's a video game or whether it's just an app for your phones or anything. These are just all the things you have to think about when you're creating any sort of software. Somebody, and I get this all the time, someone says, well, um, my video game doesn't have resources and entities. Well, then your video game can't be programmed and it's not a great game. Every single computer program has resources and entities, and that's actually how computer programs are built, is that way. So, and even board games have resources and entities. They're called the pieces of the game. So if a dice game didn't have resources and entities, then it wouldn't have dice. The dice themselves are resources and entities. The players playing the game are resources and entities. Even the board is a resource and an entity, and every little spot on a game board of a board game. So even non-digital games, non-video games, soccer has resources and entities. The players, the coaches, the lines on the field, the nets, the soccer ball. Every single game has resources and entities. Every single computer program has resources and entities. So now we're going to talk about how to finesse your game, how to balance all those resources and entities together in a way that makes the game really, really fun. Games that aren't balanced aren't fun. And game balancing is the not fun part of being a game designer or even a computer programmer. But it's the most important part, because if you're not willing to be bored doing it and to do something tedious and awful doing it, then people aren't going to buy your game and give you a lot of money to go have fun with in other areas of your life. So game balancing is super important. So we're going to start with the chart, which I accidentally showed earlier, but that's okay. And this is why game balancing is important, because you want to hit that middle sort of diagonal thing there, flow. You want your game to have flow, which means you don't want it to be so hard that it just causes so much anxiety. I don't like being anxious. I don't think many people do. If a game is overly anxious, they'll slam the remote down, throw their console through the window, and then be mad at you that they have to go buy a new remote and a new console, right? But you also don't want your game to be too boring. You don't want the game to be so dumb and so boring that they play it for 30 seconds like, oh, this is lame. I'm going to go, do something else. I'm going to put in somebody else's game. So so that centerpiece flow there is really hard to hit. It's really hard to make a game. It isn't too anxious or too boring. One of the assignments for this unit is researching why the game Civilization has so many difficulty settings. It's because that game is a very complex game with lots of mechanics and lots of things going on. And so that was their way of letting the player choose their own flow. That was their way of letting the player decide how boring or anxious they wanted to be, how good they were at it. So that's a way of that some game makers have found to make their game hit that middle flow, is we'll let you choose how hard or easy or hard to make the game. Some recent games I've played let you change the difficulty in the middle of the game, and they tell you at the beginning of the game, choose the difficulty, but don't worry, you can change it at any time. So if you choose easy, but it's too easy, halfway through the game, you can say, I want to make this game harder, and you can increase the difficulty level. If you choose difficult and it's way too difficult, the game's so hard, and you want to chick it out, then they let you change it back down to easy halfway through the game. And so that's one way of creating flow. And yet you still want to strive for not needing those types of things. You still want to strive for that middle area where it's not too anxiety inducing and too boring. So here's some key concepts for how to do that. One is your game should be fair. I think that goes without saying. Games should be fair. So games should not end in a stalemate. Some games do. We're going to talk about a very popular game at the end of this lecture that ends in a stalemate. It's kind of annoying that way. But otherwise, it's a great game. But games should not end in a stalemate. There should be a winner and a loser at the end. There should be a way to win them. It's not fun to spend hours playing a computer game only for the game to come back and say, well, you and the computer are equally matched and there's no way to see the end of this story. There's no way to get to the end and watch the end credits. Sorry. That kind of stinks. Games should get harder at an expected pace. Games should not go from really easy to suddenly being one shot. I'm gonna make fun of one of my favorite games here, Zelda Breath of the Wild. Zelda Breath of the Wild has some really weird mechanics in it where suddenly you walk into an enemy base and the enemy swings a little club at you and you're dead. And that shouldn't happen in a game. That's actually one of the things that game's been criticized for, being a great game in every other way. So yeah, games should get harder than expected pace. You shouldn't go from really easy to suddenly getting one shot in like 30 seconds and be like, well, now I have to wait for the game to reload and watch a game over cutscene, right? Games should get progressively harder at the same pace so that you know what to expect, right? And early mistakes should not cost the player so much that they can't recover. So if you don't know how to play the game, if you know nothing about the game and you make just an early simple mistake early on, that should not cost you so much that they can't recover. By the way, all four of these things are things that teachers think about all the time when we design classes. And so if you flunk a test early on in the class, let's say I give you a test 2 weeks into this class and you get an F, and I tell you on week 3, sorry, there's no way you're not going to get an F in the class. You should have done better on the test. That's not fair, right? That's not fair to you. And so I know you probably know some teachers who've done it. There should always be a way that an early mistake should, be recoverable. That's true in video games. It's true in class. I would like to hope it's true in workplaces too. That if somebody makes an honest mistake, they should be able to recover from that. They should be able to move on from that. So I worked in a job where I made an honest mistake early on. I was told something, I misunderstood that something, and it caused some stress and chaos, and within 3 months, they had fired me. That wasn't fair. That wasn't fun for anybody involved. There were other factors that also went into that. They actually didn't have money for my position either. So real life is a little bit like that. Life's not fair, and yet we should all try to make life more fair. So that's true in video games. It's true in real life. So these are key concepts, right? So that make your game fair. Fair is fun. Fair is fun. Games should not end in a stalemate, right? Somebody should win. So if you're going to invest hours in this thing, there better be some end credits to watch. Games should get harder at an expected pace, and early mistakes shouldn't cost you so much. So with that said, let's go back to this slide from last week. Hopefully you recognize it from Core Mechanics. Every game has resources, entities, and attributes, right? So that's how games work. That's, as I said, that's how computer programming works. So every game has resources, entities, and attributes. We talked about all that last week, and we talk about that's how your game goes on. That's how your game moves forward, which is okay. So now let's talk about balancing your resources and balancing your entities. So here the game's economy. All resources must have a place where they come into the game. All resources must have a source. Meaning this is where these things come into the game. Some of them come into the game when you start the game. So I think about chess, right? All the pawns and the queens and the bishops and the king and the rooks and all that, their resources, what is their source? Their source is the beginning of the game, right? That's a source, right? They are at the beginning of the game. There's actually another source if you've played chess. There's another source for your pieces, and that is if you move the pawns across the board, the pawns can be converted to a piece that's been removed from the game. That's the third thing down there. Some resources should have drains. Not all resources have to have a drain. I think about experience points in RPG games. They don't drain. Once you have them, you have them. However, I'm thinking the enemies obviously have a drain. There's a way to defeat enemies, and when their HP drops to 0, HP has a drain. When it drops to 0, the enemy disappears from the game map. It's drained out. It's gone. You've defeated the enemy. So some resources have drains, and I would argue in every single game there should be a resource that has a drain. In chess, the drain is when you move your piece on top of somebody else's piece. That piece is drained from the game. There is a way to bring them back, which I talked about, but they're drained. They're gone. Some resources then can be converted to another. every game should have some resources that can be converted to another resource, which means the initial resource is now gone, and in its place there is a new resource. So I think of war games. War games, you usually have money, and the money can be converted to a soldier. You lose the money, it's gone, it's out of the game, it's not coming back, but now you have a soldier or a tank, right? Or an airplane that can go shoot stuff and drain other enemy units off the map, right? And then some resources can be traded with others. So this is different than conversion. Traded is when the resource stays in the game. And so, so if I trade my money for a soldier, the money's gone, right? It's gone. But if I have a trader in a game, like let's say an RPG game, and I go to a store, and Skyrim has this where I can use my money to buy a sword, then that money actually stays in that seller's like money. Like every seller only has so much money, and so when I sell something to him, he has that money, and I can actually go sell something else to him to get that money back. Hopefully that makes sense. Not all games need a trader. Not all games need to have a trade mechanism where the resource stays in the game and I can always get it back. Another example of this is the game Kingdom Rush, which is a mobile game. You get stars when you complete each level, and you can trade your stars for attributes for your troops. So remember, attributes themselves are resources. And if you decide that you don't want that attribute, but you want to spend those stars on something else, you can actually sell or trade the attribute back, get the stars back, same amount of stars back, and buy another attribute. So that's a trade instead of a conversion, because the stars are actually still in the game. Whereas conversion, it's out of the game. It's gone. So hopefully I explained that well. I would argue every single game needs to have the first three. The last one, not every game needs. So all resources must have a way they come into the game. Some resources in your game should have a way they go out of the game. And some resources should be able to convert to other resources. And then you can build a trade mechanism for a specific type of game. So with that said, here's a wonderful example from Super Mario Brothers way back in the Nintendo area. This is just a great example of this, and very simple one. You've all played Mario. Each level has coins that Mario can collect. That's the source. When the level loads, the coins are scattered throughout the level in various spots, and then when Mario collects them, then he has them. That's the source. So if you want more coins, you can go back and play a level, and they will resource. They'll respawn, we call that in video games. And then if I get 100 coins, they can be converted to 1 life. So that's a conversion mechanism in Mario. 100 coins can be converted to 1 life. And then lives have a drain mechanism. When Mario dies, they are drained out of the game. And he's gone. And then in later Mario games, they created a trade or conversion mechanism that coins can also be used to trade for special items like mushrooms, special outfits in the later Mario games. And so it's all coins. Coins come in at a source. They convert to 1 life and are drained out of the game. You cannot trade lives for points back. It's not a trade. The coins are gone and you have a life. The lives are drained when Mario dies, or you can use your coins to buy special items and trade for special items. But once again, that's a conversion actually, because the coins are gone once you spend them. So hopefully that made some sense. So with that said, when you're thinking about your drains and your sources and your conversion and trading, you want to create some feedback loops. That's how you balance your game, is there's a feedback loop. And so at the bottom there's an example from the book where it says you can you have stones, and the stones they give you at the beginning of the game, and then maybe you can use your stones to build something like a stonecutter's hut, and then the stonecutter's hut builds more stones, which you can then use to build more stonecutter's huts, which build more stones, which builds more stonecutter huts, and that unlocks ways. Maybe you can also use the stones to build catapults, because catapults throw big stones, right? And so then there's a drain there. That's a feedback loop. Feedback loops are great. They're how most games work. So obviously in Mario, your feedback loop is coins make lives, and lives give you an opportunity to try again to a point, and that's a feedback loop. And then if you try again, you're going to get more coins, and then as you get more coins, you're going to get more lives, and if you get more lives, you're going to get to try again, which gives you more coins. And there they create a feedback loop, which also is called a mutual dependency. So mutual dependencies are coins make lives. Lives gives you opportunity to get more coins. So they are mutually dependent on each other. You need one to build the other. And that is really fun. Because when you get one, you can build the other, which makes one, which builds the other, and players enjoy the freedom and options. And then as things expand, then that's great, right? So you also think about experience. In RPG games, experience gives you levels. Levels give you greater attack power, greater defensive points, greater defensive position. They give you better special skills, and then you use those to defeat bigger enemies. And then when you defeat the bigger enemies, when they are drained out of the game, they give you more experience points, which allows you to get even stronger and even better, right? And so it just goes. But you do have to be careful with this to avoid a deadlock. Deadlocks are not fun. Deadlock is what happens when I run out of stone. So let's say I have a game where I have a bunch of stones, right? But then I spend all my stones, and now I can't build any more stonecutters huts, and now I'm done. Now the game is deadlocked, and I can't do anything more. And the stonecutters hut, for whatever reason, doesn't give me as much stone as it should. And that's a deadlock, which means I can't do anything, which creates a stalemate, which we want to avoid in video games, right? Avoid stalemates at all costs. So, with that said, there are two ways to balance your game economy, two ways to use those principles to balance the game. One is what's called a static equilibrium, which means if the player walks away, the stone cutter's hut is still going to make stones, and they don't need to do anything, and they can walk away, they could go make a sandwich, they could go play another game, and they can come back. And there aren't any drains. The stone hasn't been drained, and now they can come back and have millions and millions of stones. Game that you probably haven't heard of, not many people have heard of, but I played it when I was a kid, is Sim Tower, where you build this really cool tower with like a mall inside of it, and apartments and office complexes and a parking garage underneath it. It's a really fun game. You're basically building a mall, but it's a lot of fun. But I learned early on, if I walked away from that game, so I would turn it on in the morning and I'd go to school for 6 hours and I'd come back and I'd have millions and millions of dollars because it was a static equilibrium. There were no drains. There was no way to keep from making money. And so then I'd come back and I'd build this really cool tower in like seconds, and then I'd be bored. And then I've dropped out of the flow. I've hit bored. So really, that's okay with some games. Static games are fun, and it was fun to actually come back and have millions of dollars to spend. But you want to aim more for a dynamic, which means that things can get drained and the player has to constantly work to at least maintain the status quo and improve the game. And so that means that, that if they walk away, troops are going to come in, destroy those stonecutter huts, which means your stones are going to get drained out of the game and you're going to lose. So that's a dynamic equilibrium where they have to both work to fight away the drains and keep building resources, right? So with Mario is a dynamic economy, because if Mario dies, or if he just stands still, nothing happens, right? And then an enemy hits him and he dies, right? So that's dynamic economy. Static is okay, but dynamic's more fun. And so here's some parting thoughts for this very brief lecture. I want you to think of rock, paper, scissors. That's a great game. The resources in rock, paper, scissors are rock, paper, and scissors. Pretty simple game. Rock has a different mechanic than paper. Paper has a different mechanic than scissors, which has a different mechanic than both. And so rock, paper, scissors, you have three entities. They exist in relationship with each other. Rock's mechanic is that it destroys scissors. Scissors' mechanic is that it destroys paper. Paper's mechanic is that it destroys rock. I don't know how paper destroys rock. I've tried it a few times in real life. It doesn't work. But in this game, we pretend it does. That's the magic circle that we're all in. And what a magic circle it is. And so rock, paper, scissors are completely different from each other. And yet, there's a fair way to win. It's a fair game. All three have drains. All three have a way that they can be drained out of the game. Rock can destroy scissors, right? There are no dominant strategies. There's no way for one person to dominate. When I was a kid, we invented dynamite, right? Dynamite destroys all three. So that's a dominant strategy. It's not very fair. It's not very fun, but it's a good joke to play on your friends. We just stuck our thumbs up and said, boom, I destroyed all of you, right? But scissors could defuse dynamite. We decided, and we invented all kinds of mechanics there. But the simple game is it's fair, it's fun, yet there is a fatal flaw in the game, isn't there? There is a way to stalemate. And that's if I do rock and you do rock. If I do paper and you do paper. I don't know, Big, you guys, how many times you've played rock, paper, scissors where you've tied. I think my record is I tied somebody 22 times in a row, which is huge. And at one point it gets funny, but also it's not fun anymore. And so rock, paper, scissors uh, is the three exist in a wonderful equilibrium. Three entities and they can drain each other. Obviously, they're sourced at the beginning of the game when you say rock, paper, scissors, right? Shoot, right? Shoot's the source where they come into the game. They're drained out. And yet, there's got to be a way to fix that game where there aren't stalemates. So think about rock, paper, scissors when you're making your game, right? Think about your resources and entities and how they exist in harmony with each other, and what can be converted to what, and what can destroy what, and whether or not you have a static and a dynamic way of the game, and how you're going to break stalemates when they happen, how you're going to break deadlocks when they happen. That's what's going to keep your players in the flow and keep them having fun with your game. So good luck, game designers. Let me know what questions you have.